Good evening. My name is Georgia Schaefer-Brown, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum and the Department of Economics, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, The Ends of Freedom, Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. When I began taking economics classes at Dickinson, I saw economics concepts as abstract and inapplicable to real-world issues. Or rather, I failed to see how topics in economics connected to issues of social justice that I felt passionate about. But through my classes at Dickinson, and while researching in preparation for this event, my view of how applicable economics are has expanded. Concepts of economics underlie most discussions of contemporary issues and surround topics from the environment to universal healthcare. This event is particularly relevant in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, as inequalities in housing, employment, and healthcare intensified, and discussions regarding the economic rights of Americans have garnered national attention. Tonight, Dr. Paul will discuss how classical economists have influenced Americans' collective understanding of freedom, which has evolved since the nation's founding. Dr. Mark Paul is an assistant professor of economics at Rutgers University and a member of the Rutgers Climate Institute. His research interests include political economy, environmental policy, and the inequality of race, gender, and class. Paul's scholarly work has appeared in outlets such as the New York Times, The Economist, and the Washington Post, and he has worked with several congressional offices to draft legislation. His first book, The Ends of Freedom, Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights, will be published in May 2023. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of an emergency, note that accessible exits are located on the west side of this building. At this time, I ask that you silence all cell phones and electronic devices. And now, please welcome Professor Mark Paul.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here. I do want to note, while I am a professor at Rutgers University, we are currently on strike. So I am here in my own professional capacity as an individual, not representing Rutgers, because I am partaking in withholding my labor from the university until we get a fair and equitable contract for all workers. So I'm thrilled to be here with you this evening to discuss The Ends of Freedom. It is real, it exists. I got the first copy in the mail just 2 weeks ago. And it will be out on May 12th. So, I came to this book out of a deep desire to rethink the economy, out of a need to consider the fact that we live in a tremendously wealthy nation, yet we continue to have just rampant economic inequality and disparity despite extreme abundance. And so, I wanted to dig into thinking about how do we build a different economy. So that's what I'd like to speak with you all about this evening. So in 2017, Philip Alston, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, did a tour of the United States. He went to places across California, Missouri, Alabama, Georgia, Puerto Rico, and the nation's capital. And he met with unhoused people living here in Skid Row, which is in Los Angeles, just 2 blocks away from where I spent last year at a think tank working for a billionaire. This is part of USC, and this billionaire bought the most beautiful building in downtown LA. If any of you ever saw Blade Runner, it's actually the building in the film Blade Runner. And it's this just historic, gorgeous building that just exudes opulence, and it's 2 blocks away from the largest homeless encampment in America. And so during the days, I would walk down Skid Row and kind of contemplate our society. And Alston's words really rang true to me. He was curious how it was that you could have the richest nation ever to have existed tolerating such inequality and such poverty. And he was curious to what ends. What he saw just absolutely shocked him. When you walk down a place like Skid Row, you realize that people don't have fundamental access to things like toilets or running water. And that becomes apparent to not just those living there, but everybody in the area as well. And Alston was curious, why is it that he met with people who had no teeth? Because here in America, we don't count teeth as part of one's body when we cover folks with health insurance. And so Alston was left trying to understand, why is it that the poor in America live essentially akin not to what he would have imagined for the land of the free and the home of opportunity, but really much more akin to what he saw in war-torn nations when he was touring concentration camps. And so Alston was left wondering, what was the point of this suffering and this deprivation? And what Alston was seeing, I will say, unfortunately, is nothing new to scholars like myself who have spent our careers looking at inequality. And, when we study the United States, what we see is we don't just have one nation, but we have a tale of 2 nations. We have a tale of a nation of the haves and the have-nots. And indeed, these are starkly different lived experiences here in the United States. So, I want to start off in saying maybe things aren't so bad. Let's look at a couple promising economic indicators to think about how our economy is actually doing today. So just before COVID, we witnessed and lived through the longest economic expansion in history. We actually had 128 days of consecutive economic growth, about 10 and a half years, okay? And indeed, following the COVID crisis, we had the fastest economic recovery on the books. Following the 2008 crisis, it took us a full 10 years to regain the jobs we lost. Following COVID, we regained those jobs in just 2 years. A really monumentous job done by policymakers. But the headline numbers are good. If we look at unemployment before the crisis was 3.5%. Today it sits at 3.6%, but just 2 months ago it actually hit a 50-year low. And indeed, black labor force participation rate, which is how many black workers are in the economy as a proportion of the entire population, as well as black employment, is at record high levels right now in the United States. If we look at consumer finances, according to the credit bureaus, right now credit scores have just never been better. And according to Fidelity, there's more Americans with $1 million in their retirement accounts than has ever existed. Fidelity being the largest holder of retirement accounts here in the United States. And wages continue to grow, topping $30 an hour right now. But if that's not enough, we can just look at our houses. The average American home built today is over 2,600 square feet. It's 1,000 square feet larger than just a couple decades ago. I mean, so a McMansion for everybody seems to be the new norm. But these headline numbers, I think, while encouraging, are not translating into quality of life for far too many people. In 65 years ago, in 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote The Affluent Society, where he was reflecting on and kind of condemning our society to accepting public squalor amidst this extreme abundance. The book was actually just published 2 decades after President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed that he saw 1/3 a nation ill-clad, ill-housed, and ill-fed. And Roosevelt wasn't being hyperbolic. At that time, we had 40 million Americans, which was roughly 1/3 the nation in poverty. Now, I'm sad to report that when Galbraith was writing, and just a couple years later when President Johnson introduced the war on poverty, there still were indeed 40 million Americans in poverty. And so today we've developed the internet, we've sent people to the moon, we all carry smartphones more powerful than we could have ever imagined in our pocket, yet we still have 40 million people in poverty. And so I think we're left asking, how and why can this be? Now, I do want to note, we have had a decrease in the poverty rate as our population has grown, yet, 40 million people is a tremendous amount of avoidable human suffering. It's not just the poor who are struggling, it's also the middle class. Now, 52% of Americans identify as being in the middle class, yet they too are one economic speed bump away from poverty. In fact, roughly 1 in 3 Americans can't afford a simple $400 emergency expense. $400 is nothing. $400 is an emergency room visit if you're covered by really good health insurance. $400 is blowing a tire. $400 won't even cover, a brake job on your car. So, really, we're talking about people who are living paycheck to paycheck on a regular basis. Now, rent is the most important number in the economy. We often think about the most visible number in the economy. That's gas prices, right? You drive around and you see the price of gas multiple times a day, every day. But rent is the most important price. It's the where we spend most of our money. Yet a minimum wage worker can't afford the rent in any county in this country. Not a single county is affordable for a minimum wage worker. And indeed, 43 million Americans currently can't afford to pay their rent. They're what the government calls rent burdened. And this isn't because they're living beyond their means, it's because affordable housing just doesn't exist and they're just paid too little. When we look at people of color, we're actually looking at Black and Latinx households that can't afford their rent more than half of the time. So this problem is just exacerbated for them. And similarly, millennials, which I count myself amongst, are increasingly priced out of the market, right? Part of this American dream is acquiring this beautiful small house with a white picket fence. Yet millennials are 37% less likely to own their homes than their parents were at our age. And that idea of the American dream, which is supposed to be alive and well, back in the 1960s, 92% of people could expect to out-earn their parents. Today, just half can. And so we're seeing continued decline in economic mobility here in the United States. So the United States is deeply unequal, but maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe that's just the price we pay for economic growth and prosperity. Now, I will warn you, in the past few decades, economic growth has been notably slower under the neoliberal era than it was during the post-war era. So in fact, that doesn't pass the sniff test. Nevertheless, America is an incredibly wealthy country. If our riches were distributed equally, each and every American would have more than $500,000 to their name. Most households would indeed be millionaires. They'd be doing pretty well. If income was distributed equally, each and every adult would have roughly $95,000 to their name, just shy of 6 figures and doing pretty well. Would you be living the Jeff Bezos lifestyle? No. But would you be able to afford, a pretty high standard of living? Absolutely. But that's not the America we live in. And so then the key question arises, what is to be done about it? The 2008 financial crisis shook the nation to the core, and people started reevaluating our economic system. How and why do we organize our economy this way? What's the point? Is this the right way to do it? And indeed, movements started reacting. And here I'm showing you a photo from Occupy Wall Street, which was pushing back against the current organization of the economy, searching for something new. And their rallying cry was that they wanted an economy built for the 99%, actually coined by Professor Joe Stiglitz. But that's a slogan. What does it mean? And nobody had an answer to that. And so that was one of the key questions that motivated me and pushed me into economics in the first place. Now, in comes 2015. And in 2015, we have a kind of disgruntled older senator from Vermont decide to run for the presidency. And he's running on ideas that are deemed to be radical. He's pushing ideas like a $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, college for all, and they're called outright bad ideas, dangerous ideas, demagogic ideas. And so I was left wondering, here's somebody trying to build an economy for the 99%. Is he misguided? Did he have good intentions but bad policies? Were the economists who came out in force against him, were they right? And were these ideas indeed radical and foreign to the American experience? Or have these ideas actually been part of the American conversation, since there was an American conversation that was contemplating for how do we organize our society and how do we provide for all Americans? Now, before we can get into that, I thought we need to understand what was Sanders and Occupy and the people disgruntled with the economic system. What were they responding to? And indeed, they were responding to a particular set of ideas that today we call neoliberalism, but that was really peddled by folks like Ronald Reagan. And indeed, Ronald Reagan, when he won the presidency by storm in 1980, came out and proposed an economic Bill of Rights. And Reagan's economic Bill of Rights had 4 ingredients. The first was tax cuts, everywhere and always. These tax cuts, he slashed the top marginal tax rate from 70% down to 50% and then down to 38%. The second ingredient in his recipe was deregulation, get rid of all the red tape. Third, we have an expansion of the private market into every crevice of lifestyle. No, we shouldn't, or what is the best way to organize all activity? Markets. Markets provide people with choice, and therefore we maximize freedom if we provide people with that choice. And finally, we have to crush the labor movement. Now, this might not sound like it's a good tenet if you're trying to promote freedom, as Reagan purported to be doing. But Reagan said, unions are basically like mobs, and we need to get them out of here. We need to, again, allow workers to be free to choose. Now, Reagan didn't come up with these ideas on his own. Indeed, Reagan was really the puppet in many respects of a cadre of influential economists who developed the ideas behind what we call neoliberalism today. And nobody played a bigger role than Milton Friedman. Now, I would argue that Hayek we should think of as the father of neoliberalism, but Friedman is really neoliberalism's favorite son. And Friedman really popularized the ideas behind neoliberalism and those ideas that went on to help push Reagan to the highest office in the land. And he did so all in defense of freedom. Indeed, in capitalism, freedom is the most often used word, used hundreds and hundreds of times. But we need to ask here, what was Friedman actually talking about when he talked about freedom? What did that mean to him? What did that mean to Reagan as they pushed through these reforms to unleash free markets, right? It's even in that term of how they discuss markets, free markets, not any type of market. What did that quite mean? And so to understand that, we actually have to turn to this philosopher, Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin coined this idea of two concepts of freedom. And Friedman and Reagan and others were really talking about what Berlin calls negative freedom, which is essentially freedom from government. And when we think about freedom here in the United States, what comes to mind? The Bill of Rights, right? Perhaps the most known document in the world when people think about freedom. And what the Bill of Rights is doing is telling us what we're free from, right? We have to keep in mind, we're pushing against the crown. The states are rebelling against monarchy. And so what's important is that we clearly outlined American freedoms as pushing off the state, freedom from the state. And this is the exact same type of freedom that Milton Friedman was co-opting and utilizing to defend this idea of unfettered markets as the core guiding principle. He was trying to inoculate the market from democratic overreach. We can't have democratic control of the economy. Instead, we need markets to be the guiding principle so individuals can choose for themselves. Now, that's only one type of freedom. There's a second type of freedom that we should talk about, but often doesn't resonate as much in the American conversation. So when you ask people what freedom means to them today, you might have images of the "don't tread on me" flag, which has become increasingly more positive. Again, negative freedom. But the other side of that coin is positive freedom. It's what your government owes you. Now, positive freedom might seem alien to some Americans, but indeed we have them already baked into our system today. We have a right to an education. Now, that education happens to be guaranteed from kindergarten, although increasingly at pre-K. My district in New Jersey this year just launched a universal pre-K program, through high school. And indeed, this idea that every American, to participate in our society, has a right to an education, to be a fully formed human, and to engage in our political processes. Now, in my work, I seek to develop a comprehensive prescription for the problem of persistent economic inequality and insecurity, one based on this expanded notion of freedom. The US can indeed eradicate poverty and inequality through guaranteeing what I call economic rights, things like the right to a well-paying job, the right to healthcare, the right to a home. And these ideas might seem, again, radical or foreign in many respects. But indeed, we don't have to look any further than the founders, the more radical founders like Paine and Hamilton, to think about how we've been talking about positive freedom since the very beginning of the American conversation. Indeed, Thomas Paine argued at length in Common Sense, which is the most incendiary and most widely read pamphlet of the Revolutionary era, that we should abolish inheritance rights. And indeed, if we wanted a true democracy, we needed to have some semblance of economic freedom. The very idea of Social Security and a basic income came from Paine. Likewise, Hamilton, who has experienced a resurgence thanks to a small Broadway musical, was always fighting for what he deemed and called the means proper. He thought that we needed a strong central state. For those of you who watched the play, Hamilton was fighting for a strong central government, which Jefferson was pushing back against. Why did he want that strong central government? He thought the strong central government was the only way that we could guarantee people the proper means to develop as humans, that we needed a strong central state to build up the economy and provide people with jobs, with schools, and with access to basic goods and services. So this was at the core of Hamilton's fight for a centralized state. But perhaps Lincoln did the most to enshrine these ideas of positive rights into law through a number of acts, including the Homestead Act, where he actually distributed 160 acres of previously indigenous land that was forcibly dispossessed indigenous groups from, but basically handed that money for free over to largely white settlers. I mean, they paid a nominal filing fee, but this was Lincoln's way to provide people with their own economic security, with economic freedom. And indeed, Lincoln, coupled with the work of General Sherman, even went so far as to push for 40 acres and a mule, which guaranteed economic security not only to white Americans, but also to newly freed, previously enslaved Black Americans as well. Unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated before that dream could be fully realized, and Reconstruction came to an abrupt end, and this dream of 40 acres of a mule was never fully realized. But the dream didn't die with Lincoln. Indeed, of the American luminaries who have argued most forcefully for economic rights, I think we have to put President FDR front and center. So in 1944, President Roosevelt provided his second to last State of the Union address. And at the time, the Allies had turned the tides of the war and were able to think about policies on the domestic front. What would the post-war order actually look like? And so Roosevelt enumerated this through proposing a 20th century economic Bill of Rights. And for Roosevelt, that meant things like the right to a job, the right for every business person, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of free competition. Here he's pushing against the oligarchs of the time. the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, to protection from economic fears of old age and sickness, and of course the right to an education. Now, Roosevelt, in conjunction with his labor secretary, Frances Perkins, whose birthday happens to be today, the first female member of the cabinet, somebody who I think is deeply underappreciated in American history, was able to achieve progress towards many of these rights through New Deal action. Right? I mean, this is where much of the modern day social safety net comes from. But Roosevelt, too, would pass just a year after proposing these economic Bill of Rights, and he would not live to see them fully realized, even though he called on Congress to act on them immediately and to secure them for all Americans. Now, the leadership of the Democratic Party, unfortunately, abandoned this idea of economic rights, but the civil rights movement didn't let it die with Roosevelt. Indeed, the civil rights movement understood that economic rights and civil rights are inextricably linked. This notion of civil or political rights, they argued, was fairly meaningless without basic economic rights met. When you're worried about your next meal, where you're going to sleep at night, it's really hard to do just anything else. And so King, along with people like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and King's intellectual and life partner, Coretta Scott King, fought for legislation to enshrine an economic Bill of Rights into law. And they put forth things like the 1966 Freedom Budget, which essentially argued for the economic Bill of Rights all over again after they had secured passage of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. This is when they turned their attention in earnest to economic rights. And King, indeed, when he was assassinated, was supporting striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, to help secure their right to a union and a living wage. And in fact, King's final piece he wrote, which was actually published after his death, just days after his death, was entitled, "We Need an Economic Bill of Rights." Now, King's partner, Coretta Scott King, would actually go on to help achieve progress towards one of those rights, the right to a job, through passing the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of '78, which actually created the modern dual mandate at the Federal Reserve. So for those of you in your economics classes, when you're learning about price stability and full employment, this is where the second mandate, the full employment mandate, actually comes from. It comes from the civil rights era, as a matter of fact. But those economic rights to this day have not been fully realized. So we're left asking, where do we go from here? And so drawing on Roosevelt and King's ideas, Freedom Is Not Enough proposes a new economic Bill of Rights, a 21st century economic Bill of Rights, to actually build an economy for the 99%. And here, what's really instrumental in my thinking is thinking about not only how do we set a floor in the market that nobody can and should fall beneath, building not just a welfare state, but what I call a well-being state to make sure that everybody flourishes. But also, how do we think about bounding markets from the top? Do we want to consider, for instance, top tax rates that just don't allow billionaires or, people owning exorbitant amounts of wealth to hold such power and such wealth in the first place? So rather than, making society subservient to the market, how do we make the economy subservient to democratic interests and needs? So we won't have time this evening, unfortunately, to dive into all of them, but these are the basic rights that I cover here in the book, ranging from some of Roosevelt's, like a right to work, a right to housing and education, down to new ones that I've added, including the right to a clean and healthy environment. This is particularly pertinent given the climate crisis that we're all facing today and living in, to the right to a union so that we can expand democratic control into the workplace, right? It's kind of funny when you think about this idea that we live in a democracy, yet then where do we spend the most of our waking hours? We spend them in a workplace that is organized purely hierarchical. And so what would it look like to rethink that? Now, this is going to require a tremendous amount of restructuring of the American economy. So I don't want to undersell that very fact. But what I try to do in the book for each of these rights, and each right is a chapter, is do three things. One is talk about the history of this fight in the American context. Indeed, each and every one of these rights have been fought for in some instances for decades, in other instances for centuries in our own country. And what does that history look like? The second thing is to kind of explain what is the traditional economic pushback against these ideas, because let me tell you, the pushback is fierce. And then third, as an economist, I seek to turn that conventional wisdom on its head and explain why is developing the right to a job or the right to education, which I think of both encapsulating pre-K and higher ed, actually make economic sense, providing that positive case for each. So we'll talk briefly about a couple of them, and then we can delve into it more during the Q&A later. So the first right that I want to dive into is the right to work, which unfortunately has been co-opted and corrupted by conservatives to mean the right to evade a union through an open shop workplace. And I think that we should think about how to reclaim this, because when you ask people, and I did, we ran some extensive polling, you ask people what a right to a job means to them. And it doesn't mean the right-wing talking point of evading a union. Indeed, it means the right to access to work, and that work to be, pay somebody enough money to put food on the table and a roof over their head. That's what this idea means when you just talk to normal Americans. But how do you actually realize that idea? As a professor of policy, we need to think about how do we operationalize these things. And so I contend that there's three components. First is that we need to have a federal government that is actually committed to running the economy at full capacity. So right now, for those of you watching the news, the Federal Reserve is trying to manufacture 1 million Americans that are unemployed, okay? Right now we have 6 million Americans already unemployed, but the Federal Reserve, their stated policy goal is to create an additional 1 million Americans on the unemployment rolls. It's their stated goal. I think we should push back against such narratives and argue that we need to push towards true full employment, running the economy hot. Second is a permanent increase in public employment, whether these be school teachers and school aides or, postal workers, park workers, you name it. The US has the smallest public workforce amongst high-income nations. And indeed, our public workforce is about half the size of France or Germany's when you control for population, and roughly a third of the size of countries like Finland or Norway. And so we should have a sustained increase in public sector employment to provide us with, indeed, more services and better services. And then the third is this idea of a job guarantee. It's that a normal capitalist economy isn't going to provide a job for everybody at all times. So indeed, the government should employ people at a living wage, and what we detail in the book is that wage would range from $15 to $25 an hour, include health care and other benefits, so that unemployed people, rather than sitting at home, can actually contribute to our society and provide meaningful labor that not only gives them an income, but also gives them work experience, which is very valuable to re-enter the private workforce, and dignity. So we've done this before. Some of you might have heard of the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Works Progress Administration. I'm a national park lover. Most of our national parks were built indeed by the Civilian Conservation Corps. They built beautiful things that almost 100 years later we're still benefiting from. So why don't we do that again? The second right is the right to housing. And this right essentially is trying to get at how do we provide everybody with a safe, stable, and healthy home. We turn housing from a nexus of profit into a nexus of community, where people are encouraged to stay in their homes and have a place to actually live, right? That's the point of a home in the first place. It's increasingly become a financial asset in our economy, but how do we push against that tide? And the two policies that I argue for in the book, one being particularly controversial and the other one being perhaps slightly more digestible for economists, are this idea of combining rent control. And so what rent control is simply saying that every month your rent, or every year, which is most rent contracts are annual, your rent can only go up by so much. Maybe that number is 3% or 5%. That could be open for debate. But instead, what we've seen the past 2 years is that rents have been going up by double digits. Well, if you're living on a Social Security check, or if you are a minimum wage worker, or even just a middle income worker, as most of Americans are, they can't afford a $500, a $700, a $900 increase in their rent because their landlord says so. So rent control will simply rebalance the power relationships between landlords and tenants to provide people with additional stability and affordability. And if folks are interested, we can dive into the economics of this because it's I think a juicy one. Social housing is the second component. Now, many of you might be familiar with America's public housing today, and our public housing tends to be, unfortunately, fairly low quality and in general degrading. Why? Because public policy made it that way. That was intentional. We could have chosen to do it differently. And indeed, anybody who hasn't been to Vienna, Austria, I encourage you to go and just check out the beautiful social housing that they have built, not just for low-income people, not just for middle-income people, but for all-income people. Indeed, over 85% of people living in Vienna, Austria, which has been rated the most livable city in the world 11 years running by the radical left magazine Forbes, live in public housing. Okay? These public housings have kindergartens, they have restaurants, they have Olympic swimming pools, they have community gardens. They are gorgeous. I remember my first time going to Vienna. I went to visit a grad school mate, and I'm sitting in the middle of Vienna and I'm looking around at her apartment and I said, "What do your parents do? They must be bankers." That's what I was thinking. I didn't say that part. I wasn't that rude. She said, "It's a public housing flat." She paid at the time 800 euros a month. On average, people in Vienna pay less than half of what folks do in London for an equivalent apartment and just 40% of what New Yorkers pay. Okay? The idea there is everybody can and should have nice things. So how about a right to an education? Here we are in an educational institution. Many of you are probably paying quite a bit to be here indeed. And so we could fundamentally rethink this idea. And we have. Every morning, 51 million Americans wake up, roll out of bed, throw some clothes on, maybe grab a toaster strudel, and get onto that yellow school bus that they take to class. They walk through that front door and they're not given a receipt. They're not asked to show proof of payment because the cost is $0. We treat K through 12 education as a public good, which is what it is. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, it wasn't until the grassroots movement that we call the high school movement pushed to expand public access to education through high school that we even had a right to high school. Indeed, in 1910, roughly 12% of Americans had high school degrees. By 1940, more than half of Americans did. Why? Because we provided universal access to free high school. This was no longer a good, just available to the wealthy. We need to do the same thing for college today. Now, you'll have people push back. They'll say that the proposal isn't well targeted. Right? This is what Hillary Clinton said in 2016. Why should I pay for Donald Trump's kids to go to school? They'll say that college for all is regressive. Right? Why should we pay for disproportionately higher income people who go to college in the first place? So why should we pay for disproportionately higher income people to benefit from free college? And they'll say it's just downright too expensive. We can't afford a program like College for All. So in the book, I dive into each of these at length and kind of debunk them thoroughly, because these are ideas held not just by the right, but by the democratic establishment as well. But I think that they're all bad economics. The opportunities missed by implementing means testing. So what's means testing? It's saying that you get some benefit based on what your income level is. So all of you fill out FAFSAs. I hated FAFSAs. They are the worst. And indeed, we don't treat you like full adults. We treat students like children by doing so. Other countries instead say, no, 18-year-olds are fully functional adults that should not depend on their parents to continue their education and prosper as a young adult in our society. So instead, not only will we give them free education, but indeed we'll pay them during their education so that they can afford things like rent and cheap beer, and cereal or lentils, right? Many of you are living off lentils probably, and the like. Now, this idea that it's regressive or poorly targeted, I think, was really dispelled by this beautiful study by an economist at University of Michigan, where what they did was they took advantage of a means testing program where in Michigan, low-income people already got to go to school for free. But it was a really complicated program that many people weren't even aware existed, and then most of them that, the people who knew it existed, it was too complicated for them to figure out. This is why we have low uptake of many benefits here in America, from higher education benefits all the way to food stamps. And so what these researchers did was they sent out stickers to a bunch of low-income students. They had a control group and a treatment group, and they sent out pamphlets and stickers to them that just said, college is free, apply. That's it. And what did they find? They found that for the two groups, the group of students who got that treatment, now both groups qualified for the program already, were twice as likely to apply to the University of Michigan and other public schools, and more than twice as likely to actually attend. And so, in other words, so many people are missing out on those benefits just because we make the programs intentionally complicated so people don't actually take advantage of high-quality public programs in the first place. And then we miss out on those people becoming college educated, becoming doctors or nurses or teachers, and contributing greatly to our society. That's a tremendous loss for our economy. In terms of too expensive, let's keep in mind that the current system is exorbitantly expensive, as anybody with student debt already knows, right? So in terms of too expensive, I think we need to think about what are the economic costs and benefits of a higher education program, and then also, to build a nation that has more robust democratic institutions, particularly as our democracy is coming under increasing threat. What role does expanding access to education play there? And I don't think you can put a price tag on that. Not everything can be boiled down to a cost-benefit analysis. All right. So we're going to save the other economic rights for later, but I want to talk briefly about the trillion-dollar question. These economic rights sound nice, but the key question remains: how are we going to pay for it? This question always rears its head. Now, when we ask this question, I would encourage us to separate it into two distinct questions. One is, where do the dollars come from? Okay. The second one is, where will the real resources to fulfill these economic rights, the social housing units, the teachers to expand a right to college, the nurses and phlebotomists to expand a right to medical care, where will those people come from? Financing the economic Bill of Rights, coming up with dollars, that's the easy part. Let me explain how. First, we could substantially increase government debt. Pre-K is a case in point. The return on investment on universal pre-K in America is estimated at about $8.50 per dollar invested. In other words, when you invest in productive programs that increase the productivity of the American economy and society, the programs pay for themselves. You don't have to pay it back. It pays itself back through higher economic growth. The second is broad-based tax increases. Right now here in the United States, we actually pay an average of just 24.5% in taxes. The average tax burden on middle-class people is less than half of what it was in the 1950s. So yeah, I do think we should increase taxes modestly across the board. But we don't just care about what we pay in taxes. We also care about what the benefits we get. If all of a sudden we don't need to pay for daycare, if all of a sudden you don't need to have student loans, if all of a sudden you don't have, I pay $830 a month for my medical insurance premiums. It's a lot of money. But I don't have to pay that, right? If I'm paying $500 a month more in taxes, but I don't pay $830 towards my medical insurance, I'd count myself as better off. I don't know about you. I have more money in my pocket at the end of the day. So we crunch the numbers and we find for most of these rights, indeed the vast majority of Americans come out ahead. Yes, they pay higher taxes, but they also get more benefits, and at the end of the day, they have more money in their pockets. Third, we should think about Pigovian taxes. Now, do me a favor, who's taken an economics class before? So when you learn about Pigovian taxes, you often might hear they're taxes on what we call social harms, taxes on alcohol or cigarettes or things like this, pollution, carbon taxes. Well, I'd argue in a society as unequal as ours, we should think about taxes on the extremely wealthy as a form of Pigovian taxes. It not only brings in money to help finance social programs, but it also helps protect our democracy from political capture by the extremely wealthy individuals. Now, maybe you don't buy that, and that's okay. You don't need to, because even if you just take straight neoclassical theory, as Thomas Piketty and his co-authors have, they find that the top marginal tax rate in the United States should be 81%. Is that lower than potentially putting a true ceiling on income? Maybe we should actually put a hard limit that nobody should earn above a certain dollar amount. Indeed, Roosevelt actually proposed an income limit, right? Not just minimum wages, but maximum wages. And if we enacted it today, it would be about $450,000. I don't know what the right number is. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's 2 million, maybe it's 10 million. I'm not sure, but I think it's a conversation that we should have. And then finally, we should strongly consider reorganizing the government's budgetary priorities away from subsidizing violence and imperialism and toward subsidizing care, sustainability, and human flourishing. Now, the true challenge is, where will these resources actually come from? This is the legitimate hard part. And I try to explain, how it is that we can do this, but I don't think we should underestimate how challenging it is to reorganize our economy and train those teachers and build that capacity so we can decarbonize our economy and provide all with a healthy and stable environment, and to, ensure that we have enough hospital beds so that everybody has high quality care and the like. So we're going to have to engage in substantial investments to build out the supply side of the economy in essential sectors. Okay. Second, we're going to have to train a lot of people. And thankfully, if we make higher education free, right, and we nudge people in certain directions, I think that's quite achievable. Now, one thing that always kind of sticks me is how we treat teachers here in America. And it's not just what we pay teachers, but it's actually how we look at them, how we talk about them, who goes into the major and why. You go to a country like Finland, and I don't mean to be up here and just saying Finland's great, because it's not. It has its problems. Every country does. But teachers are treated on the same level as doctors and lawyers in terms of respect and dignity. And I do think that fundamentally matters in terms of the youth deciding what they want to be. Why do youth want to be doctors and lawyers? Yeah, it's because they make a lot of money, but it's also because of the social prestige. Prestige matters. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel like we're valued by our peers. And I think the way we treat teachers in this country has to fundamentally change. So no, it's not just about economics. It's a broader cultural conversation we need to have too. Finally, I think one of the biggest struggles that we have right now is simply a lack of government capacity. We've led attacks to defund the government my entire life and most of your lives. And so we need to think about, how do we actually improve government capacity to build things? Right now, the government's really good at cutting checks. The Inflation Reduction Act is really a tax cut bill. Social Security is the main thing that the government does for most people. Okay? They cut checks. They're not very good at building anymore. And so we need to have serious conversations about how can we start building and doing so effectively. Now, with that, I want to end with the very idea that the real constraints, and not the dollars and cents, are the real hurdles to meet our national priorities. More doctors and nurses and electricians will need to be trained. Supply chains will need to be improved, and efficiency will need to be enhanced substantially. But as John Maynard Keynes says, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. We will now begin the question and answer portion of tonight's event. Because the event is being live streamed, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you prior to asking your question. We also ask that, out of respect for limited time and the questions of other audience members, that you keep your questions brief and you return the microphone after asking your question. We also always reserve the first question for students, but after that, we would love to open it up to the rest of the audience. And with that, we are looking for our first question.
Hi, thank you for such an awesome talk. My grandfather is in love with Frances Perkins. She like lived in his frat house when he was in school. It's a weird thing. Anyway, but I was wondering if you could just talk about what she did and who she was, because I think that story is not told well enough.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So Frances Perkins was a social worker, okay, and an educator. And Frances Perkins went to school for social work to try to help the poor, the destitute, and the struggling. And she quickly realized that her voice and her actions could only go so far. As an individual, yes, we can help people, and we can make change in our communities. But she saw public policy as the key lever to facilitate the change that she sought. And she was actually radicalized during the famed Triangle Fire in New York City. She was actually sitting outside right in front of that factory where hundreds of garment workers perished working in a garment factory. She was sitting outside a cafe having tea with a friend and saw that fire go down. And that's when she changed from a social worker to an activist. And this is where she realized that in order to improve people's lives, we have to pursue policy measures to structurally change the way our economy is organized. And so, decades of activism lead to her to be pursued by Roosevelt as his Secretary of Labor. And indeed, Roosevelt called her to his townhome in New York City. And when he summoned her, she showed up with a sticky note. And she said to Roosevelt, now mind you, this is the first woman in history to ever be offered a place in the cabinet. And she said to Roosevelt, I need to think about it, but I need you to think about it too. And I will only accept this job under the following conditions. We need to fight for eliminating child labor. We need to fight to implement Social Security. She wrote the Social Security Act. We need to generate unemployment insurance. We need to pass national health care and more. And she left. And she said, unless you agree to all of these, my answer is no. That takes some guts. And Roosevelt phoned her the next day and said, you've got it, as long as you lead the efforts on these. And indeed, each and every of her demands was met, except for universal health care. And that was her biggest regret, was that she was not able to get that accomplished during her time as Secretary of Labor. So I encourage you to go read The Woman Behind the New Deal, a beautiful book written about Perkins, to learn more about her. So thank you for your question.
Hello, and thank you for giving this talk. I really liked it. So I've heard that the conventional economic wisdom is that rent control often decreases the quality of housing available. Is this true? And if so, to what extent is it true? And what nuance is missing, if there is?
Yeah, great question. So there's kind of three traditional arguments made against rent control. And let me back up and say that this is universally held by economists. So the Chicago Booth School does a poll of economists all the time about key important issues. And they did a poll on rent control and whether it was good or bad for the economy. And 82% of economists said it was bad, 2% said it was good, and the rest said they didn't know enough to have an opinion. And indeed, the best-selling undergraduate textbook by Greg Mankiw, George H.W. Bush's chief economist, says the best way to destroy a city other than bombing is to implement rent control. I mean, this is crazy stuff, right? So it makes you think this must be a horrendous policy. Again, good intentions, bad policy. So there's three main components that they push against. One is that rent control reduces the supply of housing. Two is that it reduces the quality of housing. And three is that it doesn't actually work. It doesn't actually lower prices. Each of these is wrong. And the empirical evidence shows it to be the case. Now, economists used to make similar arguments about the minimum wage. And for anybody, now I don't know how you all teach minimum wage here at Dickinson, but if you take an Econ 101 course, you often learn supply and demand, and minimum wage is bad. Again, false. In these pretty little models, it makes common sense. But indeed, the models and the assumptions behind them are wrong. And the empirical evidence over the past 15 years has showed that. And in turn, economists have started to change their tune. And I think we're at the cusp of this in rent control as well. So let me take each three of those. So does it reduce supply? The answer is no. Why? Because who builds the houses and then who owns the houses are different entities. So it doesn't change a builder's incentive to build a house. And indeed, when new homes, new apartment buildings are constructed, they are offered on the market at what we would traditionally call market rates, what I would prefer to call landlord set rates, because I don't really think that there's some perfect market that sets rates. But a builder, right, builds a house, and they can put those apartments on the market for whatever price they want. And it's not until after they are rented does the rent control that, say, limits rent increases to, let's just say, 4% a year, kick in. Now, let's say a new train station gets built in that neighborhood a decade later. The landlord says, aha, I can now increase the rent by 20% and capture the benefit from that public service, that access to a train station. And indeed, this is why you see many renters oppose improvements in public services because they're worried about gentrification. I can't afford to stay in my neighborhood. Well, indeed, rent control just changes it so that the landlord gets some benefit. They can increase rent by up to 4% a year, right? Maybe they were only being able to increase it 2% before. That neighborhood's become more desirable. But indeed, now the tenant also gets to benefit from the improved desirability of that neighborhood. Often, this is especially true because often tenants are the ones that make certain neighborhoods more desirable in the first place. So really, rent control is just trying to smooth out the rental market and take away some power from landlords and give it to renters. I also want to note, we already have rent control in America. Half of Americans benefit from rent control. I do. It's called a mortgage. Okay? Everybody in this room with a mortgage, or your parents with mortgages, gets 30 years of rent control. We just haven't provided it to tenants yet. Your main question, does it affect quality? Again, the empirical evidence says no. Original rent control implemented during World War I, that was true. And that's because there was a hard limit that said you could not increase rents, full stop. That's not what we do today. Today, we say you can increase rents, again, running with the previous example, by 4% a year. But there are exceptions. One of those exceptions is what we call capital improvements. Again, this depends on how you design the policy. So you can design bad rent control policy or you can design good rent control policy. A good rent control policy would account for capital improvements. A landlord wants to spend $20,000 to redo a kitchen. They can bake that into a rent increase over the next 15 years. So rather than being able to increase the rent by 4%, the city all of a sudden might let them increase the rent by 7%, okay, and get paid that money back over a set period of time. So that no longer leads to a negative effect on quality. So in general, the conventional wisdom on rent control, I think, has been slowly proven to be misguided when we actually look at the empirical evidence.
Could you address the impact of the free market impact here on market value of real estate? People being able to afford to buy a house, okay? The impact and the economic impact that has on the ability of the workforce to move from one location to another to take advantage of jobs that are available. We have so many jobs today that are not occupied because people just can't afford to move. The impact being is that the cost of real estate takes them not out of the market per se, but the ability to take advantage of moving up in a job market.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a loaded one for a few reasons. So first of all, I don't think free markets exist. I think this is a myth that Friedman and others created. All markets are structured, right? Markets don't exist without rules and regulations. And who creates those rules and regulations? Government policy. And then the question becomes, how do we shape markets and to what ends? Okay. The housing market, particularly, is an example where free markets don't exist. The 30-year mortgage that I alluded to earlier as creating rent control for half of America, was created out of whole cloth through the New Deal, okay, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Prior to the New Deal, mortgages lasted on average 5 years, and they were not fully amortized, meaning today you pay the same amount every month for 30 years, and at the end you own your home. Back then, you paid the same amount every month for 5 years, and then you owed half the value of your house in cash to your bank immediately, or else they'd take your house. They called a bullet payment. So the whole 30-year mortgage was created by the government. No other country has a 30-year mortgage the way we do here in the United States. And that mortgage market would not exist without the full backing of the government. Indeed, the government underwrites through Fannie Mac and Freddie Mac the vast majority of American mortgages. This helps subsidize homeownership and generate wealth, particularly for white Americans. Now, pertaining to your question on the job market and mobility, I mean, I think it's a hard question. Are we, we are not as mobile of a society as some people might hope, particularly to be able to move for job prospects. But I don't think that's just about housing costs. I think that there's a lot of other things going on here. So first of all, I just moved. Moving is expensive. The average move in America costs $4,500, and let me tell you, I don't know how somebody moves for $4,500. I did it, most of it myself. I drove my own U-Haul, and I still spent more than $4,500. And I moved with the movers and all the stuff. So moving itself is expensive. But the second thing is, we're human beings embedded in communities. And so I think that, should people at times move for job opportunities? Yes. But I also want to highlight the fact that, we have social relations that are very well developed. We have friends, we have family, we have loved ones. And so this idea that people should just pick up everything and move just for a job always, I think is something that I just want to be cautious about. Because I do think that, we are whole humans that are more than just our job. That said, should we improve economic mobility and push policies to reduce housing costs? Absolutely. What I mentioned today, social housing and rent control, that's part of the problem, part of the solution, but we need to do a lot more to just make it easier and cheaper to build housing in America, in particular dense housing, meaning multifamily housing. And we are seeing encouraging trends the past couple of years with a huge uptick in multifamily housing units, often driven by millennials and Gen Zers having a preference to live in urban areas, plus being too poor to buy homes, so having increased demand for rent.
How do you think housing being a human right will impact home ownership being one of the main sources of wealth accumulation in the United States?
That's a good question. For most Americans, the wealth is, you always hear this adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Most Americans put all their eggs in one basket, and it's called their home. Right? That's where the vast majority of wealth sits for middle-income people that own homes. Now, what's the point of home ownership? It's kind of twofold. One is to provide you 30 years of known mortgage payments and neighborhood stability and a place to live. And the other is to generate wealth. Now, transitioning to a Homes for All type program, I think might put some downward pressure on home ownership. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I don't think Americans should have everything in one basket. Talk about mobility. I think actually home ownership is one of the things that restricts economic mobility and geographic mobility in America. That said, home ownership is also the means through which most people accumulate most of their wealth. And so we'll have to think about potentially other avenues. Now, I, to be frank, am much less interested, though, in thinking about how to generate wealth than how to make wealth fundamentally less important for economic security and opportunity. And so that's the area of the conversation that I tend to focus on. But I agree with you that that's something that deserves a lot more attention. Yeah, thank you.
would you do anything about like corporate home ownership? As in, like, I'm sure you've seen the headlines of like big corporations buying up plots and plots of single family like homes in like Florida and other states. And like, is that unhealthy for our market, or is that something that rent control kind of deals with on its own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think rent control certainly helps get at it a tremendous amount, but I don't think it would by itself, address the issue. So for those of you familiar with groups like BlackRock and other private equity firms, we're seeing a huge increase of corporate ownership of apartments. And the main reason is that they're a very safe, stable income stream. Particularly given that we have a housing shortage in America, everybody's gonna need housing. These corporations realize if they buy up lots of it, they also then tend to have outsized market power. And once they own it, they can raise rents faster because people don't have any other options. And this leads to an improved income stream. So should we do something about it? Yes. What is the right policy response? I'm gonna be honest and tell you I don't fully know. But I think that if you don't have a senior thesis yet, I think it's a great topic. And I'd love to read it after you write it. While she's delivering this, I will note for the students in the room, you can pre-order your copy for $26. If you're a student and you can't afford $26, email me and I'll send you the proofs for free.
I have so many questions now, having listened to you. So now I'm trying to figure out which ones to ask. I guess I'll start with, or ask initially, if there's time. You mentioned that you didn't agree with how the Federal Reserve is handling the current issues of inflation. So, but you didn't mention what you think they should be doing.
Sure.
So what do you think they should be doing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's easy to be a critic. It's cheap. That's the cheap side, right? What do I think they should be doing? First, let's back up and ask the question of what's the fundamental problem? And the fundamental problem is inflation. Now, I want to be honest. I was wrong on this one. I was and remain largely on what we call team transitory, thinking that inflation is largely a transitory phenomenon and will, in general, take care of itself. I still think that was the right idea, and I still think that that holds true. I thought, though, it would take care of itself far faster than it has. If we look at the numbers today, I don't think we have that much of an inflation problem anymore. Inflation is currently at 4.5% to 5%. Now that sounds high for some. The Federal Reserve's target is 2%. Where did 2% come from? Ask the Federal Reserve. They're going to tell you they pulled it out of their you-know-what. And I'm not kidding here. There is no economic cost to 5 or 6% inflation versus 2%. There is no economic rationale. Maybe the macroeconomists will agree with me, but there is no economic rationale to why 2%. Why? Because we said so, and this is what we agreed on. So I think it's the wrong target, first of all, and I don't see a problem with 4 or 5% inflation. I truly don't. The Federal Reserve thinks that we have too much inflation, and so they're raising interest rates. And we are actually seeing, an unprecedented rapid hike in interest rates today. And as I mentioned, their goal is to slow down the economy and throw over 1 million Americans out of work. How do we control inflation according to the Federal Reserve? We increase the cost of borrowing, we slow down the economy, which means layoffs and less hiring, which means that fewer people have money to buy essentials, to pay the rent, to put food on the table. I think that's a pretty poor theory of how we control inflation. I think of it as taking a sledgehammer to the economy. I would prefer to opt to hire a surgeon, if you ask me, to fix my broken leg. So what does a surgeon do? Well, I had the pleasure of writing a bill with Representative Jamal Bowman on exactly this question. And so we wrote a bill looking at targeted strategic price controls in the economy to limit price increases in certain areas, including housing, energy, food, and the like. And so I think that through government policy, we could actually slow price hikes literally through mandate, as we've done, by the way, multiple times in US history, including the entire time in World War II, where we had an Office of Price Controls that even went so far as to set the prices on what you pay for shrimp cocktail, okay? This is the level of detail they went. Actually, James Galbraith was the head of that office, who wrote the book, The Affluent Society. For the students in the room who haven't read The Affluent Society, it's so good. You can read it in like 2 days. And it's so good you can even read it sitting outside in this beautiful weather. It's not dense, I promise. So I think we do things like price controls. I also think we do things like strategic investments. Okay, why did we have inflation? Most of inflation was actually driven by the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which sparked an energy crisis. Now, what does that tell us? Does that tell us we should hike interest rates and throw people out of work? Or does that tell us that we should develop a green domestic energy sector that actually, once and for all, promotes energy security? If we actually look at the last time we had relatively high inflation in the US in the 70s, it was again due to international tensions, this time in the Middle East, that led to an energy price crisis as well. So I think that there's a lot of other tools, really price controls and strategic investments to expand the supply of certain things, and also policies to force supply chains to be more resilient in the first place. But I think that just thinking that hikes will do it is a really crude approach to a really complex economy that I just think requires far more careful tinkering. But it's a really important question, so thank you.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Thank you. In this day and age, there is more like targeted advertisement than ever. The lottery is really big, and there's a rapidly growing gambling industry. And so I was going to ask you, along with the economic Bill of Rights or economic rights to things you need, what about the power of the government and like private entities to force people into addictions where they have to spend money on things they don't need?
It's a great question. I'm sorry? The role of marketing and generating consumer demand for things we don't really need and what to do about that. So, right, do we all need a new iPhone every 2 years? Do we all need a new pair of sneakers every 3 months, right? No, we don't. There's a tremendous amount of consumption that we don't necessarily need, okay? But the whole job of marketers are to convince us that we need these things. And this has been true since marketing existed. So, do I think that there should be a lot more government regulation over marketing, particularly marketing geared towards teens and young people? Yes, absolutely, right? So in Europe, most of Europe, it's illegal to target ads at children, for example. In the US, that's not the case. I mean, just watch kids programming. I mean, it's wild how much we're pushing toys and sugary cereals and the like on children here. So yeah, I think we need a lot more regulation over marketing. But I also think that I'm not a marketing expert, but I do think that it's a really important question that we need to think about. How do we better regulate marketing and firms' abilities to convince us that we need certain things, again, to promote human flourishing rather than promote this endless accumulation of stuff. I mean, we live in a capitalist economy, right? What does that mean? Well, there's no purely capitalist economy. There are public schools. Those are, I would say, socialists. There are fire departments. I would say those are socialists. There's our libraries. Could you imagine modern policymakers creating the library system? Like, they would be like, okay, you could rent 1 book a month unless your income's above this threshold, and then you have to pay $3 a day for the book, or you can't even use our computers if your family makes over 100 grand, and you have to bring in your tax documents to even set foot in the library, and it would be a disaster. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that we need to think about how do we take some space back from the market? And I agree with you that requires, being much more strategic in what we allow and don't allow in terms of both advertising and then also our data, which is often freely available for firms to scrape online. So again, great thesis topic.
All right, this concludes tonight's event. Thank you so much. Please join me in giving our speaker a huge round of applause.